Okay. I'm just going to jump right in with that fertile ground thing. So, you know, we've talked about how Palfrey and Murfin and Sears have very successfully established the collective memory of the Battle of Antietam. Why was it so successful? Was there fertile ground in the culture when Palfrey wrote his first book? Why is that?
Well, Palfrey did not invent the anti-McClellan society. McClellan was very much disliked during the war. He had many enemies during the war. And I think a lot of this has to do with politics, Jim, politics. And I'm talking about national politics. McClellan's a Democrat. We all know that. They all knew that. We all know Lincoln's a Republican. Herein is the tension. McClellan, even in 1862, is the most likely Democrat to run for president in 1864.
Well known.
He's the best known. He is famous. He's a successful general in this regard. He wins, or even if he hasn't won, he can spin it so that it looks like he wins, the political spin. And so our nation, since its commencement, had a tendency to elect successful generals, beginning with George Washington.
And Jackson.
And Andrew Jackson is another good example. And so if McClellan is permitted to succeed, if McClellan is seen as successful, he is going to be able to garner votes as a successful United States general, as a veteran. At the time of the Civil War, we knew the political affiliation of generals. They didn't disguise it, they didn't hide it, they didn't try to remain neutral. We knew who the Democrats were that were generals, we knew who the Republicans were that were generals. It was perfectly acceptable, and it was just part of the norms of our society at the time, part of being part of a democratic, representative, constitutional republic. It was okay to have your political affiliation, your political interest known. You wore it on your forehead. It was right on your sleeve. Everybody knew your political party. Today, we don't know, and that's good. I am glad we don't have the same sort of norm in our society today. We don't know the political affiliation of any of our generals, and we shouldn't, because every general or every admiral in the United States military should defend and protect all of us, all 315 million of us, regardless of political party. It makes no difference what our politics are individually. For them, they protect all of us. They defend all of us. They are the ones who allow us to be political and to have political parties. They're the ones who permit us to allow politics to exist. And so if the day ever comes where our generals and our admirals once again are identified with a specific political party, and that's publicly known, we are in grave trouble. We never want to go back to the days of the Civil War when politics was so pervasive in the personality and character and identity of generals.
Here's something to think about. The ongoing reputation or disreputation of McClellan, the letters to his wife, which were very sort of what a guy writes to his wife, they came much later. McClellan was a very potent political figure, even up to 1864. And why I say that, in other words, there hadn't been the future revelations that were damaging. When the election in 1864 occurred, you know, the electoral vote was a landslide, but the popular vote was not. And McClellan got a big vote. So I'm realizing that if, once again, like you said, context during the Civil War, there was always a big chunk of the population that wanted just to negotiate the separation and be done with it.
Well, and McClellan had grave differences with President Lincoln on two fronts. One was the issue of emancipation, and two was the issue of a conquered Confederacy. McClellan was very opposed to emancipation, and in the summer of 1862 he wrote a heartfelt and very thoughtful letter to the president on reasons why there should not be emancipation. Now, we today, I read that and it offends me, and I am not at all in support of virtually anything George McClellan has to say about why we should not have emancipation. I'm opposed to everything in that letter. But again, in 1862, McClellan is representing the Democratic Party. He's the spokesperson for the Democratic Party. The Democrats were staunch supporters of continued enslavement, of the institution of slavery. And McClellan represents that point of view. And so his letter to Lincoln in the summer of 1862 that says, the greatest mistake that you could ever make, Mr. President, is emancipation, front and center puts McClellan and Lincoln at great odds with each other in terms of the future of the nation. The second thing deals with this idea of how do we end this war? The Democrats were much more interested in simply ending the war, keeping the Constitution as it is, the country as it was. So that means that slavery would continue to exist. We get over this spat, we just end it, and we all come back together again. In other words, nothing's been cured. What caused the war doesn't get cured. We end the war, we still have a disease. But that was the position of the Democrats. The Republicans, on the other hand, had a different point of view. They believed that we needed to change, ultimately that we needed abolition and emancipation, freedom, and that became a major cause. Plus, they also wanted reunification of the country. Secession would not stand. We could not allow the Confederacy to stand. These were the two basic platforms that Lincoln eventually conducts the war upon: reunification of the Union and emancipation, the abolition of slavery. And so, very opposite points of view. And let me finish by saying
sure.
that everybody knew George McClellan was going to be the Democratic candidate in 1864.
Even in 62.
Yeah, there's no question. That was the trajectory of George McClellan. He will be the Democratic nominee. In September of 1862, after Antietam, the most famous man in America is George McClellan. He's victorious. He has saved Pennsylvania. He has protected Maryland. The nation's capital is safe. The invader has been thrown back to the land that he came from. He has defeated Lee not only once at South Mountain, but he's also defeated Lee at Antietam. Lee has gone backwards. And he saves the country again when he stops Lee, thwarts Lee, blocks Lee at Williamsport. Doesn't give him an opportunity to continue the invasion after Antietam. So McClellan is heralded as a hero. The press will embrace him as a hero. Even the Republican press, which hated McClellan, was willing to give him credit for stopping the invaders, defeating Lee, something that had not happened before. And so universally, in the immediate aftermath of Antietam and the end of the invasion, McClellan is a great hero. This cannot stand. This is not, we can't allow this if you're a Republican. So there is a, not so much by President Lincoln, but there's a concerted Republican effort to denigrate McClellan, to demolish him, to ensure that he cannot stand on a podium of heroism and victory. And it succeeds. This is in 1862, less than a month after the battle. There is the clamor, there is the cry that we need to move. We need to crush the enemy. We need to destroy the enemy. McClellan hesitates, and Lincoln tries to compel him. His boss, Henry Halleck, tries to force him to move, and McClellan just doesn't. And so there's this sense that McClellan has reverted back to his old tendencies of, well, I've won, or they're not going to bother us. But McClellan's plan was never to crush the enemy.
Right.
McClellan's plan was negotiated
Was
peace.
the Democratic plan.
It was the Democratic plan. And as a result, of course, McClellan will be fired, as he should have been, by the president, because of the odds, they read up such odds on what the future of the country would be. McClellan should have been fired by Lincoln. Lincoln did the right thing.
This is a big question I have. There's this little moment. Here's McClellan in the height of his glory. And once again, we said that if you go back to the time itself, we know that he was terrifically successful. He beat Lee at South Mountain, as you said. He blocked him from going into Pennsylvania. Never since given credit for that, largely because the Republican narrative became our history. How did McClellan feel when his great victory became the reason for the Emancipation Proclamation?
Oh my, that probably was one of the lowest days in the life of George McClellan. September the 22nd, September 23rd, 1862, when he learns of Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation
He served a
Proclamation.
Republican goal.
McClellan thought it was unconstitutional. McClellan believed that the President of the United States did not have the power to declare emancipation, that the Emancipation Proclamation had gone way beyond the authority of the executive. And McClellan was very, very upset about this. Northern newspapers that were Democratic newspapers that leaned Democratic absolutely excoriated Lincoln and the Republicans for this whole idea of emancipation, that there's no way that he had the authority to free any slave anywhere at any time. It was not necessarily unforeseen, because the Republicans in the Congress had passed the first Confiscation Act and passed the second Confiscation Act, and Lincoln had actually warned the South in the summer of 1862 that possible emancipation would be coming as a result of congressional action in the second Confiscation Act. So, Lincoln believed it was legal and that the Congress had given him the legal authority to move forward with emancipation through the Second Confiscation Act of the summer of 1862. But McClellan dismissed all that as unconstitutional, that none of that was proper or appropriate, and that the executive had usurped his power as the executive. And so there was actually talk of a coup, of a military coup. Mm-hmm. Now, this is unthinkable by Americans, that somebody in the United States military would actually consider a coup against an elected representative constitutional government. But there were northern newspapers that were saying the president's gone too far, it's illegal, we need to return the government to within the bounds of its proper authority, and George McClellan's the man to do that. So they even used at times the word coup. McClellan actually received letters from people suggesting that he overthrow the government and establish a temporary military dictatorship. He admits this in his own letters. It's a very troubling time. One thing we need to keep in mind is that following the Battle of Antietam, the most powerful man in the United States is George McClellan, not Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
That George McClellan has a victorious army behind him. It's an army that has supported him, has defended him, has protected his reputation. And he's given them victory. He's given them their greatest victory. He's given them the greatest morale boost. And so the idea that George McClellan could never march upon Washington and establish a military dictatorship, yeah, that's possible.
This is your book, The Temptation, you talked about?
There's a chapter in here where I discuss the opportunity for the United States Army and George McClellan in particular to conduct a coup. It's real.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just dismiss it. It was a very dangerous time in the constitutional history of the United States. And McClellan says, no, I will not do that. I think McClellan's greatest gift to history and McClellan's greatest moment in history never happened on a battlefield, but occurred when he resisted the temptation to conduct a coup against a government that he detested, against a Republican president that he hated, and that violated everything he seemed to believe in, George McClellan, yet he resisted the temptation to overthrow the Republican government.
Armed forces are raised and supported simply to sustain the civil authorities and are to be held in strict subordination thereto in all respects.
He did that only a few miles from Shepherdstown at his headquarters located just south of Sharpsburg. The building that was his headquarters, the Showman Farm property, still stands. At that point, that place, that moment, on October 7th and 8th, 1862, George McClellan made American history, and he gets zero credit for resisting temptation.
Because as time went on, history took a different direction that was favoring a complete defeat of the South.
And absolute total annihilation of slavery.
Yes.
Thank goodness that's the direction we went.
What my impression is this, is that, Lincoln, ironically, he could only get rid of enslavement as a commander-in-chief, tell me if I'm wrong, in response to events on a battlefield. And when the war began, those enumerated powers of commander-in-chief were very little. And Lincoln kind of just started writing those enumerated powers, and he could do that because it was kind of a vacuum.
Well, at no other time in American history prior to the Civil War had the executive had such power. And Lincoln considered the Civil War an emergency, rightfully so. And so in Lincoln's mind, to meet the emergency, the power of the executive must expand, and he did. A great example of that power was the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus,
in an emergency.
Unilateral suspension by the executive in Lake Maryland. And then by the fall of 1862, habeas corpus had been suspended in every United States for other reasons, because of the draft and the violence that they expected as a result of forced mandatory draft. And so the president, McClellan, was convinced that Lincoln had usurped his power at the most significant way with the Emancipation Proclamation and the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, like an executive order, is not law. It is an executive's decision. It's an executive imposition. But that's why we had the 13th Amendment, of course, is because the only thing that could permanently eradicate slavery was a constitutional change. So even though the Emancipation Proclamation was legally a temporary document, McClellan did not see it as temporary. McClellan realized that the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary emancipation, set in motion something that would not be reversed. And it offended him greatly, and he resisted the temptation to personally try to overthrow the government.
Really a huge moment. The hot potato of enslavement being abolished. So here's Lee, mid-62, there's talk of Lincoln intending to go there to have emancipation, and then suddenly this quickened motivation to really go into the North and really affect the election so that doesn't happen. You can see all of this really almost exciting an effort because they see slavery being abolished in the North.
The great irony of George McClellan is that he ensures a Republican victory in the elections of 1862 because McClellan brought the Republicans victory on the battlefield.
He did.
And the other great irony is that McClellan ensured the Emancipation Proclamation because he gave Lincoln the victory that Lincoln needed before he could issue an Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
And so George McClellan's victories in Maryland and his defeat of Lee and the forcing of Lee to end the invasion of 1862 all brought about success for Republicans by their greatest Democratic enemy, George McClellan.
It glimpsed into his character. Remember, he's only in his mid-30s, like 35. Yes. So he's very smart and this and that, but he's still young, and you can sense a little insecurity there,
A lot of insecurity.
A lot of insecurity, okay. And once again, we have to always forget those letters that come back later. In the current time, he was the man, right? He was the man. But the great, like you said, the nobility that surfaced was he had everything. He saw his star rising so high, right? And that moment of reflection, even though they turned his greatest victory from a Democratic perspective to an Emancipation Proclamation battle, with all of this reversing on him, he had the nobility to not be tempted by a coup.
That's correct. He resisted the opportunity for coup. There was never in American history, in my mind, was the United States government ever so vulnerable to a military coup as it was in the weeks immediately following Antietam and Lincoln's issuance of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
This is a great book. It breaks up a lot of assumptions. I'll go back to one of the biggest things I've gotten out of this is for years I too genuflected at the altar of the firm, Palfrey, Murfin, and Sears, who also were reflections of this sort of the narrative of American history that was finally accepted, which was not the McClellan perspective. But in other words, well, all of those things served to make McClellan less important in history.
And less respected, as you were about to say.
Yeah, less respected. He made a perfect foil, and they took it even further.
Yeah, they went from foil to failure. McClellan, who was the foil, became McClellan the failure.
You can paint somebody as really evil, or completely stupid, or completely honest and completely smart. McClellan was the victim of one of those tracks, but we can maybe say it was a long-term political tendency. You can't have context in a true historian's role. You can't recreate the context of the original moment until you peel off all of these other motivations and look at what really happened. And what I learned from your book is Antietam, McClellan stopped Lee with actions at South Mountain, and then on the night of September 16th, cutting him off towards a path through Pennsylvania. He stopped the plan to invade Pennsylvania, absolutely, and he stopped him from trying again later, and that's always ignored. And secondly, he wasn't dawdling or tardy in pursuing Lee after the special order. I mean, with the all-night march of the 9th Corps and the victory at South Mountain, this is absolute refutation of the firm's perceptions of Antietam, but they have been suppressed or ignored because of this sort of McClellan issue.
That's a great summary. You know, what I try to do here in Antietam Shadows, and the subtitle is purposeful, mystery, myth, machination. And not only do I like the alliteration, but each one of those words is so descriptive. Mystery, myth, and machination is what the book is all about. And Jim, a historian has great power. great power. And what I mean by that is that we're detectives. And as the historian is doing the detective work and searching the records of the past and uncovering what we see, the historian has to be careful not to allow his or her own perspectives, own point of view, and own prejudices to control the narrative. That's what the firm did. The firm made a conscious decision that it would be anti-McClellan. And so when Palfrey and Murfin and Sears were doing their detective work, they're looking for things that take this theory of, I don't like George McClellan, and strengthen and bolster that position, that argument. But they present it as if it's real history.
That's the problem.
It's actually opinion about history. It's not real history. And so that's the power of the historian, is that when we write and we present, people believe us. They give us believability. They think that we are credulous.
It's a book.
And so they don't challenge, they don't question. If it's in writing, it's truth. Well, from the moment history's created, it's not true, because the actual creation of any historic moment is based upon someone's opinion of that event or point of view of that action. And so it's immediately filtered through the human mind and the human consciousness. So there's really no such thing as truth in history. That just doesn't exist. But the historian who writes history should not exacerbate and confine or define the boundaries of a historical event or story, because we should present maximum points of view, maximum perspectives, a maximum number of opinions in our narrative, so that we are not reserving for ourselves power, but we instead are presenting people's opinions, and let the people that are the reader form then their own opinions. In other words, the job of the historian is to be a facilitator of these opinions, these point of views, these perspectives, rather than to be a narrator of one perspective.
Set the table. Yeah. Thanks, Dennis.